Family bonds are often portrayed as the ultimate source of unconditional support, yet in many cases they become the very foundation of quiet pain and unspoken hierarchies. What unfolded 6 months ago at my brother Gabriel's engagement celebration in Charlotte, North Carolina, served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant acts of courage come not from confrontation, but from the simple decision to stop hiding the truth. It was a day that began with nervous hope and ended with me walking away from a celebration I had never truly been invited to join, leaving behind a gift that carried consequences far greater than its modest appearance suggested. Hi, my name's Valentina, and I am 31 years old. 6 months ago, I boarded a flight from Los Angeles to Charlotte, North Carolina, with a single purpose in mind. I wanted to mark my brother Gabriel's engagement celebration in some small way, even though I had received no formal invitation and knew deep down that my presence might not be welcomed. During the journey, I found myself staring at the clouds outside the window, questioning whether this trip was an act of hope or an exercise in self-delusion. I had spent the previous weeks debating with myself, weighing the risk of further rejection against the pull of family tradition and the memory of my grandmother Beatrice, who had always encouraged me to stand tall even when others looked away. The hotel where the celebration was being held stood as a symbol of refined elegance in the heart of Charlotte, its grand architecture and meticulously maintained gardens reflecting the kind of old-world charm that my family had always aspired to associate with. As I entered the lobby, the soft melody of a string quartet drifted through the air, mingling with the laughter and conversations of guests who had clearly been part of the inner circle for years. I smoothed the front of my elegant emerald green dress, took a steadying breath, and approached the registration desk where two attendants were checking names against a thick binder filled with guest details. When I gave them my name and mentioned that I was Gabriel's sister, their polite expression shifted almost immediately. They exchanged a quick glance before one of them began running her finger down the long columns of printed names, turning pages slowly, as if hoping to find what simply was not there. After several minutes of searching and even consulting a supervisor who joined them briefly, they looked up with unmistakable pity in their eyes and informed me that my name did not appear anywhere on the list. There was no reservation, no last-minute addition, nothing to indicate that I had been expected at all. A familiar ache settled in my chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. I thanked them for checking and stepped aside to a quieter part of the lobby, where tall windows overlooked the manicured grounds outside. Pulling out my phone, I dialed my brother Gabriel's number. My fingers steadied despite the turmoil inside. He answered after a few rings, his voice carrying the background sounds of the ongoing celebration, clinking glasses, cheerful voices, and music that underscored just how separate I was from the joy unfolding inside those ballroom doors. I explained calmly that I had arrived at the venue but had been told my name was missing from the guest list. There was a long pause before he responded, his tone laced with irritation and something that sounded almost like embarrassment. He made it clear that I had not been invited because this was a private gathering intended for those who had always been closely involved in his life and in the family's social circle. He suggested that my work as a fine art and portrait photographer, while perhaps impressive to some, did not place me among the kind of people this event was designed to impress. His words stung, but they were not entirely unexpected. He ended the call by advising me to return to Los Angeles without creating any awkwardness that might overshadow his and his fiancée's special day. I stood motionless for a moment after the line went dead, absorbing the rejection that had become all too familiar over the years. Rather than leave in defeat, however, I remembered the reason I had come in the first place. Tucked inside my bag was a small silver box tied with a simple white ribbon, a gift I had prepared with great care. I walked over to the gift table, which was already laden with elaborately wrapped packages from other attendees, and found a modest spot near the corner to place my offering. I made sure the handwritten card reading, to Gabriel from your sister Valentina was clearly visible before turning away. As I exited the hotel and stepped into the crisp afternoon air of Charlotte, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. I had not come to disrupt the celebration or to seek revenge for past slights. I had come because a part of me still hoped that acknowledging this milestone might open a door that had remained closed for far too long. The silver box I left behind held far more than a conventional present. It contained documents and truths that would soon force my family to see me and themselves in an entirely new light. I hailed a taxi and directed the driver to the airport where I purchased a ticket for the next available flight back to Los Angeles. During the ride, I replayed the brief conversation with my brother in my mind, wondering how two people who shared the same parents and childhood home could have grown so far apart. I thought about my grandmother Beatrice, who had passed away at the age of 85 just half a year earlier, and how she had always been the one person who truly saw the person I was becoming. Her quiet support had given me the strength to build a life far from the shadows of favoritism that had defined my upbringing. The gift I had left was in many ways an extension of the legacy she had entrusted to me, a legacy I was finally ready to claim. By the time I reached the departure gate, the initial sting of rejection had begun to fade, replaced by a growing sense of resolve. I knew that the celebration would continue without me, but I also knew that at some point during the evening someone would reach for that small silver box. When they did, everything my family had carefully constructed would begin to unravel. This was not the ending I had imagined when I first decided to make the trip, but it felt like the beginning of something far more important, the chance to finally live without constantly seeking approval from people who had never been willing to give it. If this story has resonated with you so far, and you want to hear how the contents of that silver box changed everything for my family, and for me, I would be grateful if you liked this video and subscribed to the channel if it speaks to your own experiences. Feel free to share in the comments the city you are watching from and what time it is there. Your thoughts and support truly mean the world to me as I share these chapters of my life. To truly understand the weight of that small silver box and why its contents had the power to dismantle years of carefully maintained appearances, I need to take you back through the chapters of my life that led to this breaking point. Growing up in a stately home on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, our family presented a picture of quiet affluence and tradition to the outside world. From the manicured lawns to the elegant dinners we hosted for my father's business associates, everything looked polished and proper. Inside those walls, however, the reality was far more complicated, with my older brother Gabriel always occupying the center of my parents' attention, while I learned early on how to occupy the spaces in between. Gabriel was 3 years my senior, and from the very beginning it was clear that he was the child who mattered most. He had the larger bedroom upstairs with the better view, the newest clothes that arrived in crisp shopping bags, and the piano lessons that my parents attended without fail. My belongings were often hand-me-downs from him, and the silence that greeted many of my small achievements became the background music of my childhood. I did not resent him at first. I simply accepted that this was how our family worked, with him as the shining star and me as the quiet shadow who followed behind. The moment I truly understood my place came on my 10th birthday. I had been counting down the days for weeks, imagining a celebration that might finally make me feel seen. I pictured balloons in the living room, a cake with my name written in careful letters, and perhaps even a small gathering of friends like the one Gabriel had received a few years earlier when he turned 13. That morning, I woke early and hurried downstairs, my heart full of cautious excitement. The kitchen was already busy, but not for me. My mother was on the telephone, deep in conversation about an upcoming event for Gabriel at his school, while my father had already left for his office downtown. When I reminded her that it was my birthday, she covered the receiver for just a moment and said they would do something special later. They never did. That evening, as I sat alone in my room trying not to feel the sting of disappointment, there was a gentle knock at the door. My grandmother Beatrice entered carrying a small wrapped package in her hands. She sat on the edge of my bed and handed it to me with a warm smile that reached her eyes. Inside was a real camera, not a toy, but a proper one with a sturdy leather strap and a silver body that felt substantial and important in my small hands. She told me I had an artist's eye and that one day the world would see what she already saw in me. At the time, I did not fully grasp the significance of that gift, but it became the first seed of the life I would eventually build far from home. 8 years later, I graduated from high school, having earned a full scholarship to a prestigious art program at the Rhode Island School of Design. I had worked hard for that recognition, pouring myself into my portfolio and believing that perhaps this achievement would finally draw my parents' attention in a meaningful way. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and I had been chosen to deliver a short speech about following one's passion despite obstacles. I practiced the words endlessly in front of my mirror, imagining my mother's proud expression and my father's approving nod. On the morning of the event, I came downstairs in my cap and gown, the speech notes clutched in my hand. Gabriel was at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone while my parents were huddled over my father's laptop discussing some business matter related to Gabriel's future. When I announced that the ceremony started at 2 o'clock and we should leave by 1 to secure good seats, my mother barely looked up. She explained that something had come up with Gabriel's schedule, a networking opportunity that could shape his career trajectory in important ways. My father added that photography and art, while nice hobbies, were not the sort of stable paths that would secure the kind of future they envisioned for their children. I stood there in my graduation attire, feeling the weight of their dismissal settle over me like a heavy cloak. I attended the ceremony alone, delivered my speech to a room full of strangers, and received my diploma while scanning the audience for familiar faces. Only my grandmother Beatrice was there, sitting in the front row and clapping with genuine enthusiasm that made the moment bearable. After the ceremony, she took my hands in hers and whispered that the greatest treasures are sometimes the ones passed on quietly rather than fought over loudly. I did not understand the full meaning then, but those words would echo years later when I stood outside my brother's engagement celebration with that silver box in my possession. Following graduation, I packed 2 suitcases, purchased a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, and left without fanfare or goodbye. There was simply no one left to say those words to in any meaningful way. In Los Angeles, I began at the bottom, working as an assistant to an established fine art photographer who specialized in intimate portraits and lifestyle documentation for private clients. I carried equipment, adjusted lighting, learned every technical detail I could absorb, and saved every spare dollar. Slowly, through persistence and the quiet confidence my grandmother had planted in me, I began attracting my own clients. What started as small portrait sessions grew into a legitimate business. I named it Lumina Atelier, and over the years it became a respected studio known for its artistic approach to capturing the essence of people and moments. By the time I turned 31, the company employed a team of 15 talented photographers and support staff, occupied a bright studio with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline, and had generated more than $4 million in revenue the previous year. Awards lined the shelves. Magazine features highlighted our work, and we had built a reputation for turning away more high-profile commissions than we accepted because our schedule stayed full. My family knew almost nothing of this success. To them, I remained the daughter who had chosen an impractical path and moved across the country to chase dreams that would never amount to anything substantial. Gabriel would call from time to time, not to ask about my life, but to update me on his own accomplishments. He had risen to a senior executive position at a prominent financial firm in Charlotte, and his engagement to Lillian Harrington, whose family had deep roots in the city's social and business circles, was the latest milestone in what everyone described as a perfect trajectory. During one conversation, he mentioned that our parents were hosting a celebration dinner for him and Lillian, though he made it clear in the same breath that it was for immediate family only and that my attendance would not be appropriate. I congratulated him, wished them well, and ended the call before the silence on my end could reveal how much the exclusion still hurt. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was reviewing contracts in my office when the phone rang with a Charlotte area code I did not recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to Mr. Theodore Langston, my grandmother Beatrice's attorney. He informed me gently that she had passed away the night before at the age of 85. Even though she had been slowing down for some time, the news still felt sudden and final. I booked the first available flight to Charlotte and arrived in time for the funeral, which was held at a historic church filled with hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her lifelong support of the arts. She had funded scholarships, sponsored emerging artists, and believed passionately that beauty and creativity deserved protection and encouragement. I sat alone in the third row while my parents and Gabriel occupied the front pew, accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity. Between the hugs and murmured sympathies, I noticed them exchanging glances and whispering about the jewelry collection that had belonged to my grandmother. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch fragments about its value and when they might expect to receive it. After the service, Mr. Langston approached me quietly and asked if I would stay behind for a private conversation. In a small office at the back of the church, he explained that my grandmother had visited him 2 years earlier to make very specific arrangements that were separate from her public will. He slid a manila envelope across the table containing a notarized amendment and a handwritten letter. The amendment stated that the entire Hartwell jewelry collection, valued at $3,500,000, was to pass solely to me. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter written in my grandmother's familiar script. In it, she explained that Gabriel had always viewed such pieces as trophies and status symbols, while I had always understood their deeper history and emotional meaning. She wrote that beauty was not about possession, but about preservation, and that she trusted me to honor the legacy those pieces represented. She acknowledged that my mother and brother would likely be upset and might accuse her of making a mistake, but she had watched me grow into someone remarkable, even when no one else was paying attention. The pieces belonged with someone who would cherish their stories rather than display them for envy. She asked that the arrangement remain confidential until I decided the right moment to share it. I left the church that day carrying a secret that would remain in my heart for the next 6 months. 3 months after the funeral, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Gabriel had become engaged to Lillian. The celebration was planned as a grand affair at one of Charlotte's most prestigious venues, with more than 350 guests and a budget that reached well into 7 figures. Every detail was being orchestrated to reflect the union of 2 prominent families. I waited week after week for an invitation that never arrived. When I finally called my mother to ask about it, she explained in careful tones that Gabriel and Lillian had decided to keep the gathering intimate, limited to immediate family and their closest circle. She added that I might find such events uncomfortable, and that it would be better if I did not attend. I knew from social media posts and shared photographs that the event was anything but small. 350 guests filled the guest list, yet there was no seat for me. That night, I sat in my Los Angeles studio, surrounded by the evidence of the life I had built, and made a decision. I would not beg for an invitation or disappear quietly, as I had done so many times before. Instead, I would go to Charlotte, attend the celebration in my own way, and deliver the one gift that could no longer remain hidden. I booked a flight for 3 days later, packed a small bag, and prepared the silver box that now held the notarized amendment. My grandmother's letter, a photograph of the two of us standing outside the jewelry shop she loved, and the signed contract showing that Lumina Atelier, the company my brother had dismissed as insignificant, had been hired to provide the official photography for his engagement celebration, complete with the $25,000 non-refundable deposit, and my name clearly listed as owner and proprietor. The night before my departure, I lay awake for hours, questioning whether I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, or finally step into the truth my grandmother had entrusted to me. Part of me wanted to stay in the safety of the world I had created 3,000 miles away, where my worth was measured by the quality of my work rather than by anyone else's approval. But another part knew that some truths refused to stay buried forever. I had spent 31 years accepting the role my family had assigned me. It was time to stop performing that role and simply be the person my grandmother had always believed I could become. As the plane lifted off the runway the following morning, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever happened when that silver box was opened, I would no longer carry the secret alone. The truth about the jewelry, about my success, and about the family I had been born into but never truly belonged to, was finally ready to surface. I did not know how the story would end, but for the first time in my life, I felt prepared to face it without apology. While I sat in the quiet comfort of the airline's VIP lounge at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the skyline in shades of orange and gold, I had no way of knowing exactly what was happening inside the grand ballroom of the Charlotte Plaza Hotel just a few miles away. I ordered a second cup of coffee, settled into a leather armchair near the tall windows, and tried to steady the nervous flutter in my chest. The flight back to Los Angeles was scheduled to board in a little over an hour. My phone rested on the small table in front of me, screen dark and silent for the moment. I had left the silver box behind with no expectation of immediate drama, yet some deep part of me sensed that the evening would not pass quietly. The ballroom itself was a vision of understated luxury that evening, with ivory linens draping more than 350 tables, towering centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas, reaching toward crystal chandeliers, and the gentle strains of a string ensemble providing a sophisticated backdrop. Waiters in white gloves moved gracefully between the tables, serving the final courses of an elaborate dinner. At the head table, my brother Gabriel sat beside his fiancée Lillian, both of them glowing under the warm lights. Lillian wore an elegant gown that caught the light with every movement, while Gabriel looked every inch the proud future groom. My parents sat nearby, their faces alight with the satisfaction of seeing their son achieve another milestone that aligned perfectly with the image they had always cultivated. No one at that table spoke my name. No one seemed to notice the single empty chair that should have been occupied. As dessert service began, the master of ceremonies took the microphone and invited Gabriel and Lillian to open a selection of special gifts from family members before the evening's final toasts. Lillian clapped her hands in delight, and Gabriel smiled as they approached the beautifully arranged gift table. Among the stacks of large, professionally wrapped packages from prominent guests sat my small silver box with its simple white ribbon. Gabriel reached for it almost as an afterthought, glancing at the card and letting out a short laugh that carried to nearby tables. He announced to those close enough to hear that the box was from his sister, the one who had apparently decided against attending in person. A few guests shifted uncomfortably at the remark, but the general mood remained celebratory. Lillian encouraged him to open it anyway, perhaps expecting a sentimental token or a homemade gesture. Gabriel untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay a thick envelope containing several documents. His expression changed almost instantly as he unfolded the first page, a notarized legal amendment bearing official seals and signatures. The color drained from his face, then returned in a rush of red, before fading again to pale. Lillian leaned closer, asking what was wrong, but he did not answer at first. His hands began to tremble slightly as he read the words that declared the entire Hartwell jewelry collection valued at $3,500,000, the sole property of Valentina. The second document was a handwritten letter on cream stationery. As he scanned it, the letter slipped from his fingers and drifted to the floor. My mother, noticing the sudden change in her son's demeanor, hurried over from the head table. She picked up the fallen page and began to read, her own face losing all color as the meaning sank in. Whispers began to ripple outward from the head table like rings on water. Guests seated closest had already caught enough to understand that something extraordinary was unfolding. The jewelry collection that Gabriel and Lillian had spoken of so confidently in recent weeks, the heirloom pieces my grandmother had supposedly intended for them, had never belonged to them at all. My mother whispered something urgent to my father, who took the documents from her with a grim expression. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The letter explained in clear terms that Gabriel had always seen the pieces as status symbols to be displayed and envied, while I had always understood their history and the quiet meaning they carried. My grandmother had chosen to entrust them to the person who would honor that meaning rather than treat them as trophies. At that moment, Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont, the elegant wedding and event planner who had coordinated every detail of the celebration, stepped forward from where she had been observing the proceedings. She took the legal document gently from my father's hands and examined it with professional calm. In a clear voice that carried to the surrounding tables, she confirmed that the amendment was authentic. She had been present 2 years earlier when my grandmother Beatrice signed the documents in the presence of her attorney, Mr. Theodore Langston. Mrs. Beaumont added that my grandmother had spoken explicitly about her reasons, stating that I had never asked her for anything while others had never stopped asking, and that I saw beauty as something to be preserved rather than possessed. The words hung in the suddenly quiet ballroom like a verdict no one had anticipated. Gabriel's fiancée Lillian stared at the papers with wide, disbelieving eyes. She had already told friends and family about the magnificent collection that would soon be hers, including the pearls she planned to wear at future society events. Now, the foundation of that narrative had collapsed in front of more than 350 witnesses. My father stood very still, his jaw tight, the letter still in his hand. He had recognized his mother's handwriting and the unmistakable intent behind her words. My mother appeared on the verge of tears, though. Whether from shock or something deeper, it was impossible to tell in that moment. Then someone at a nearby table noticed the final document still inside the silver box. It was a signed photography services agreement from Lumina Atelier for the official documentation of the engagement celebration. The client names were listed as Gabriel and Lillian. The total fee included a $25,000 non-refundable deposit, and the owner and proprietor was clearly identified as Valentina. The lead photographer, who had been working quietly throughout the evening, stepped forward when asked and confirmed that Lumina Atelier was one of the most respected studios on the East Coast for fine art and portrait work. She explained that while the owner did not typically attend every shoot in person, the company maintained an exceptional reputation and a schedule booked well in advance. A distinguished guest at a table near the back, Mr. Richard Langford, a media executive whose own family events had been photographed by Lumina Atelier in the past, rose to his feet. In a measured voice, he shared that he had known of my work for some time and that the studio had captured his daughter's wedding the previous year with remarkable artistry. Other guests began to add their own recollections. One woman mentioned that Lumina Atelier had photographed a major foundation gala and had been featured in national magazines. Another noted that the company turned down more commissions than it accepted because demand remained so high. The murmurs grew louder as the reality settled over the room. The sister Gabriel had dismissed as someone who merely took pictures for a living was in fact the successful owner of a thriving creative enterprise that generated more than $4 million in revenue the previous year. Gabriel turned toward Lillian, his expression unreadable. She could only shake her head, repeating that none of it made sense, that I must have manipulated the situation somehow. Ethan, Lillian's fiancé and Gabriel's close friend, placed a steadying hand on Gabriel's arm and spoke in a low, firm voice that carried surprising authority. He told Gabriel to stop talking. The room had gone almost completely silent by then, every eye fixed on the small group at the head table. The carefully constructed image of a perfect engagement celebration had fractured in real time, and there was no way to repair it in front of so many witnesses. Back in the airport lounge, my phone began to vibrate against the table. Gabriel's name appeared on the screen first, followed seconds later by my mother's number, then my father's. I let the calls ring through without answering. Within minutes, the screen lit up with notifications of missed calls and incoming text messages. Some were angry demands for immediate explanations. Others were pleas for me to call back right away because everything was falling apart. I read the messages in silence, my coffee growing cold beside me, and felt a strange calm settle over me. I had not created the documents inside that box. I had not forced anyone to hire my company. I had simply delivered the truth my grandmother had entrusted to me at the moment she believed was right. A new message appeared, this one from Ethan. He had obtained my number from the photography contract and wrote that he needed to understand what had happened. He admitted that Lillian had told him stories about me being emotionally unstable and unable to maintain steady work, stories that the family had apparently supported. He said he had believed those accounts without question and now realized he owed me an apology for accepting them so readily. He added that the celebration had ended much earlier than planned, with many guests departing after Mrs. Beaumont spoke, and the truth about the jewelry and my company became public. My parents were asking questions he could not answer, and he no longer knew what to believe about the woman he was about to marry. I typed a brief reply from the jetway as boarding was announced. I thanked him for reaching out and assured him I held no ill feelings toward him personally. I expressed the hope that whatever decision he made about his relationship with Lillian, he would find clarity and peace. His response arrived almost immediately. He wrote that while the celebration itself was over, he did not know whether the engagement would survive the revelations of the evening. He needed time to think. I turned off my phone, handed my boarding pass to the gate agent, and walked down the jetway toward the plane. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, I closed my eyes and allowed the full weight of the evening to settle. I had not gone to Charlotte seeking revenge or hoping to destroy anyone's happiness. I had gone because I could no longer carry the secret of my grandmother's final wishes in silence. The silver box had done its work. The truth about the jewelry, about my success, and about the family dynamics that had shaped 31 years of my life was now out in the open, where it could no longer be ignored or denied. Whatever came next, I would face it with the same quiet resolve that had carried me through every year of being overlooked. The door to reconciliation would remain unlocked, but I would no longer stand in the doorway waiting for others to decide whether I was worth inviting inside. The flight from Charlotte touched down in Los Angeles just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the Pacific. I collected my small bag from the overhead compartment, walked through the familiar terminal, and stepped out into the cool morning air that always felt like home after any trip. The events of the previous evening already felt distant, as though they had happened to someone else. I took a taxi to my apartment, showered, and tried to sleep for a few hours, but rest would not come easily. My mind kept returning to the silver box and the faces that must have been staring at its contents in that ballroom. By mid-morning, I gave up on sleep and went into the studio anyway, telling myself that routine would steady me. My assistant Jenna was already at her desk when I arrived. She looked up with an expression that mixed concern and something close to awe. Without a word, she turned her phone screen toward me. A video was playing, already showing more than 4 million views and climbing rapidly. The caption read something like, "Brother discovers the jewelry he bragged about belongs to the sister everyone wrote off." Someone at the engagement celebration had filmed the moment Gabriel opened the silver box and the documents spilled out. The clip captured his face shifting from smug amusement to shock. Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont's clear confirmation of the will's authenticity, the murmurs from guests, and Mr. Richard Langford standing to speak about my company's reputation. It ended with Ethan telling Gabriel to stop talking while the room fell into stunned silence. I watched the video once, then set the phone down. Jenna told me that Lumina Atelier had received more than 300 inquiries overnight from potential new clients who had seen the clip or read the comments beneath it. People were curious, some were supportive, and a few were simply fascinated by the family drama that had played out in public. I asked her to cancel all my meetings for the day. I needed time to think to let the reality of what had happened settle without the distraction of work, however welcome the new interest might be. 3 days passed in a strange quiet. I stayed mostly at home, answering only the most urgent emails and letting the rest of the world move at its own pace. On the fourth morning, my receptionist called up from the lobby to say that a woman was there asking to see me. She gave her name as my mother. I closed my eyes for a long moment before telling the receptionist to send her up. When the elevator doors opened, my mother stepped into the bright, open space of the studio. She wore one of her usual tailored outfits, but her eyes were red-rimmed and uncertain. She looked around at the framed magazine covers on the walls, the awards displayed on floating shelves, the large photograph of my grandmother Beatrice and me laughing together at one of her birthdays, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Los Angeles skyline. "This is yours?" she said quietly, almost to herself. "All of this?" I nodded and led her into my private office, closing the door behind us. She sat in the chair across from my desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though she were afraid they might betray her. She had come, she said, because she needed to talk about what had happened at the engagement celebration. She assumed I had done it deliberately to humiliate Gabriel and Lillian. Her voice cracked when she asked how I could have done that to my own brother. I kept my tone even. I reminded her that I had not been invited to the celebration. I had not stood in the ballroom and made a scene. I had simply left a gift that contained documents my grandmother had created years earlier. The documents were real. The will was legal. Everything inside that box had been authentic. My mother stared at me for a long moment, then her shoulders sagged. She looked around the office again, taking in the evidence of the life I had built, without any of them knowing the details. When her eyes landed on the photograph of my grandmother and me, her face crumpled, and she began to cry in a way I had never seen before. These were not the delicate tears she produced at social events. These were raw, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and long buried. "We failed you," she said between breaths. "I failed you." She told me that Gabriel had always been the one who demanded attention loudly and often. He had been the child who expressed his needs clearly, and my parents had responded by giving him more of everything. I had been quiet. I had never complained when plans changed at the last minute or when my achievements went unacknowledged. She had interpreted my silence as contentment, as proof that I did not need the same level of attention. She thought I was fine on my own. My grandmother had tried to tell her otherwise, had said she was losing me, but my mother had dismissed it as dramatic. Only now, sitting in the middle of the success I had created without them, did she understand how completely she had been wrong. I let the silence hold for a while before I answered. I told her that I had spent 31 years being invisible inside my own family. I was not asking for an apology or for anyone to rewrite the past. I was simply asking for honesty going forward. She nodded, wiping her face with a trembling hand. Before she left, she told me what had happened in the days since the celebration. Ethan had postponed the honeymoon. He was staying at his parents' house and had told Gabriel and Lillian that he needed time to think about whether the engagement could continue after everything that had come to light. The video had spread far beyond the original circle of guests. Colleagues at Gabriel's firm had seen it. His superiors had asked him to take a leave of absence until the attention died down. Gabriel was telling anyone who would listen that I had destroyed his life on purpose, that I had manipulated our grandmother and engineered the entire evening for maximum humiliation. I felt no satisfaction hearing this, only a heavy tiredness. I told my mother that I had not destroyed anything. I had simply stopped pretending that the version of our family my parents preferred was the only version that existed. She stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at me one more time. She said that my grandmother had always called me the strongest of the three of us. For the first time, she thought she might understand what that meant. Then she walked out into the hallway and the elevator doors closed behind her. I sat alone in my office for a long time after she left, watching the sun slide toward the ocean and turn the sky from gold to deep blue. The photograph of my grandmother and me seemed to watch me from its place on the shelf. I picked it up and studied her face, the knowing smile and the kind eyes that had always found me even when everyone else looked past. I asked the empty room whether she had planned all of this. Of course there was no answer, but I could almost hear what she might have said. She would have told me she had only planted the seeds. I was the one who had chosen to let them grow. A week later, I made the arrangements to visit the private vault where the jewelry collection had been transferred for safekeeping. The pieces were even more beautiful than I remembered from the few times I had seen them as a child. There were pearl necklaces from the 1920s, Art Deco diamond earrings that caught the light like tiny stars, and a sapphire brooch that had once belonged to a distant relative with a title. I held each one carefully, thinking about the hands that had worn them across generations and the stories they carried that had nothing to do with status or display. My grandmother had been right. These were not trophies. They were memories made tangible. I arranged for the most historically significant pieces to be loaned to the Charlotte Museum of Art, where they would be displayed in the decorative arts wing with a plaque noting that they were part of the Beatrice Hartwell legacy. The rest I would keep in secure storage until the day, if it ever came, when I had children of my own to pass them to, along with the stories of where they had come from and why they mattered. As I was preparing to leave the vault, the manager handed me a small sealed envelope that had been stored with the collection. Inside was a short handwritten note from my grandmother. She wrote that she had also left something for Gabriel, a simple pearl bracelet that had belonged to her own mother. It was not valuable in monetary terms, but it carried meaning if he could ever learn to see it. She hoped that one day he would. I stood in the quiet corridor outside the vault and let the tears come. Even in death, my grandmother had tried to leave a door open for my brother. Whether he would ever walk through it was not something I could control. All I could do was honor her memory by becoming the person she had always believed I could be, the one who understood that true strength sometimes looks like walking away from the need for approval and building a life that no longer requires it. 6 months have now passed since that evening in Charlotte. I am still in Los Angeles, still running Lumina Atelier, still waking up each morning to a life I created with my own hands. The viral video eventually faded from the front pages of people's attention, as these things always do. My name is no longer trending, and the reporters stopped calling after the first wave of interest. Some things, however, have changed in ways I never expected. My mother calls once a week now. The conversations were awkward and halting at first, both of us searching for words in a relationship that had never required much talking before. Slowly, we are learning. She asks about my work. I tell her. She listens. It is a beginning, nothing more and nothing less. My father sent a letter a few months ago, 3 pages of careful handwriting, in which he apologized for years of blindness and for the ways he had allowed favoritism to shape our family without ever questioning it. I have not written back yet. I am still deciding what I want to say, but I am thinking about it. Gabriel called once last month, the first time since the engagement celebration. He did not offer a full apology. He simply said he was trying to understand what had happened and what it meant for all of us. I listened. I told him I was willing to hear whatever he needed to say when he was ready. Whether that conversation ever grows into something more remains to be seen. I have learned something through all of this that I carry with me every day. The best response to being overlooked or dismissed is not revenge, and it is not a performance designed to prove your worth to people who have already decided you have none. It is the steady, patient work of building something real that belongs only to you. It is protecting the parts of yourself that matter most, and knowing your own value so deeply that no one else's opinion, not even the opinions of the family you were born into, can shake it loose. I did not go to that engagement celebration to tear anyone down. I went because I finally understood that I deserved to be seen, even if the only person who could make that happen was me. If you have ever had to draw a boundary with someone you loved, or if you have ever felt invisible inside your own family, I would be grateful if you shared your story in the comments. I read every single one. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not show up for one more rejection, but decide that we will no longer perform our worth for an audience that refuses to see it. Thank you for listening to this story all the way through. If it has touched something in you, I hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear that they are already enough exactly as they are. You deserve to take up space in the world without apology. Take care of yourselves. In the quiet months that followed, I found myself returning often to the photograph of my grandmother Beatrice and me. It sits on my desk now, a daily reminder that someone had seen me clearly long before I had the courage to see myself. The studio continues to grow in ways that still surprise me. New clients arrive with stories of their own, and my team has expanded to 18 talented people who share the same belief that every portrait or event we document deserves to be treated as art rather than transaction. The revenue has climbed past $5 million this year, though I rarely mention the number to anyone outside the company. Success, I have learned, is best measured by the peace it brings rather than the attention it attracts. My mother's weekly calls have become something I look forward to in a cautious way. We talk about small things at first: the weather in Charlotte, a new recipe she tried, the book I am reading between shoots. Slowly, the conversations have deepened. She asks about the clients I am photographing and listens when I describe the stories behind the images. She has even begun to share stories from my childhood that I had forgotten, moments when she noticed my quiet creativity but did not know how to nurture it. I do not pretend these talks erase the years of distance, but they are building something new on the foundation of honesty I asked for that day in my office. My father's letter remains unanswered, though I have read it many times. In it, he describes the shock of realizing how much he had missed by focusing only on Gabriel's loud achievements. He writes that he is trying to understand the son he raised and the daughter he overlooked. I believe him. One day soon, I will write back. The words are already forming in my mind, not of blame, but of the possibility that we might yet find a way to know each other as adults rather than as the roles we once played. Gabriel has not called again since that single conversation last month. I heard through my mother that he and Lillian are still in therapy and that Ethan has not yet decided whether to continue the engagement. The pearl bracelet my grandmother left for him sits in the vault alongside the rest of the collection. Whether he will ever claim it or understand its meaning is a story that belongs to him now. I have released any need to control its ending. The loaned pieces from the collection are now on display at the Charlotte Museum of Art. I visited once, standing quietly in front of the glass case, while visitors read the plaque honoring my grandmother's legacy as an arts patron who believed beauty should be preserved and shared. A young girl stopped beside me and asked her mother why the pearls looked so old and special. The mother explained that some things are valuable not because they are expensive, but because they carry stories across generations. I smiled to myself and walked away without introducing myself. The moment felt complete. I have come to understand that the boundary I set is not a wall, but a gate. It remains open to anyone who approaches with respect and a willingness to see me as I am, rather than as the version of me that once fit their narrative. My worth was never something I needed to prove through silence or through dramatic gestures. It was always there waiting for me to claim it without apology. The silver box I carried to Charlotte was never really about revenge, or even about being seen by my family. It was about finally seeing myself clearly enough to stop waiting for permission to exist fully in my own life. If you are still reading, perhaps you have your own silver box moment waiting somewhere in your story. Perhaps there is a truth you have carried quietly because speaking it felt too risky or too final. I hope this account has given you the courage to open that box when the time feels right. The cost of silence can be heavier than the risk of truth. The gain, when it comes, is the freedom to build a life that no longer requires you to shrink to fit inside someone else's idea of who you should be. Thank you for walking through these pages with me. Your presence here means more than you know. If this story has stirred something in you, I invite you to carry it forward in whatever way feels true. Tell your own story. Set the boundary you need. Claim the inheritance of strength that has always been yours. You are worthy of being seen, not because you earned it through achievement or endurance, but because you exist. That has always been enough. There is one more thing I want to share before this account closes. In the weeks after the engagement celebration, I received an unexpected letter from Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont. She wrote that she had known my grandmother for many years and had always admired the quiet way Beatrice supported the artists and dreamers others overlooked. She told me that watching the truth unfold in that ballroom had reminded her why she had chosen to work with families at their most vulnerable moments. Sometimes the most important gift a planner can offer is not perfection, but the space for truth to surface when it is ready. She enclosed a small check representing a portion of the fee from the engagement celebration, insisting that Lumina Atelier had earned every dollar through artistry rather than through any family connection. I deposited the check and added her note to the box, where I keep the few physical mementos of that day. The check itself was never the point. What mattered was the recognition from someone outside my family that the work I had built in silence held value on its own terms. It reinforced the lesson my grandmother had tried to teach me decades earlier with that first camera. The world will see what you create when you stop waiting for permission to create it. I have carried that lesson into every session since. When a client sits before my lens now, I see not just the surface they present, but the story they are still learning to tell about themselves. That is the real inheritance I received, far more valuable than any collection of jewels. In the quiet hours of early morning before the studio fills with light and voices, I sometimes sit at my desk and trace the edges of the photograph of my grandmother and me. The girl in that picture could never have imagined the woman she would become, or the family reckoning that would one day arrive because of a small silver box. She could never have known that the camera in her hands would one day document not only other people's celebrations, but the moment her own hidden truth finally stepped into the light. Yet here I am, still holding the camera in a different form, still choosing each day to focus on what is real rather than what is expected. The boundary I drew after that evening in Charlotte has held firm. It has also softened in the places where genuine effort has appeared. My mother's calls continue. My father's letter still waits for a reply I am slowly composing in my mind. Gabriel's single attempt at conversation remains the only direct contact we have had, and I have left the door open should he choose to walk through it again. The choices I wrote in my journal on the flight home that night is no longer mine to make alone. They must decide whether the version of our family they once preferred is worth more to them than the possibility of knowing me as I truly am. I no longer measure my days by whether I have been invited or included. I measure them by the quality of the work I produce, the depth of the connections I choose to nurture, and the peace that comes from no longer performing for an audience that cannot see me. The silver box is empty now, its contents dispersed into the world where they belong. What remains is the knowledge that I carried it to Charlotte, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I finally understood that some truths are too heavy to keep carrying alone. Releasing them was not an act of destruction. It was an act of liberation for myself, and in time perhaps for the family I was born into, but never truly allowed to join until I stopped asking for permission. If these words have found you at a moment when you are weighing your own silver box, I hope you will remember that the cost of silence is often paid in years you cannot get back. The gain of truth, however difficult the moment of release may be, is the chance to stand in your own life without apology. You do not need anyone's invitation to exist fully. You do not need to shrink to fit a space that was never designed for you. The inheritance you carry, whether it is a camera, a story, or simply the quiet knowledge of your own worth, is already yours. All that remains is the courage to open the box when the time is right and let the truth do what it has always been meant to do, set you free. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Your attention has been a gift I do not take lightly. If this story has given you even a small measure of the courage it took me years to find, then every word has been worth writing. Go gently with yourselves. Tell your stories. Protect your peace. And remember always that you are already enough.